The rain came down hard on the cobblestones outside Ashworth Hall, and Eleanor stood beneath the stone archway with her gloved hands pressed together, watching the one carriage she had been waiting for roll away without her. She had seen it happen with her own eyes. Her husband, Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Rushden, had walked Lady Amelia Hartley to the carriage himself, had opened the door for her, had spoken a few warm words before shutting it, and stepping back to wave as the horses pulled forward into the wet night. He had not looked around. He had not searched the crowd of departing guests for his own wife. He had simply assumed, the way he always assumed, that she had already gone home. Eleanor did not call out. She did not raise her hand or step into the light where he might have seen her. Something in her, some quiet and tired part of her heart, told her that even if she called his name, he might not turn. So she stood there instead, feeling the cold mist settle on her shoulders, and watched the carriage lanterns shrink into the distance until they disappeared around the bend of the road. Around her, other guests were climbing into their own carriages, laughing, calling farewells to one another, pulling their cloaks tight against the weather. No one noticed the Duchess of Rushden standing alone at the edge of the steps. No one thought to ask if she needed help. She was, after all, the Duchess. Surely she had everything arranged. But she did not. Eleanor looked down at her thin silk shoes, already damp from the mist gathering at the edge of the stone steps, and she thought about the long road that stretched between the townhouse where the gala had been held and her own home at the far end of the city. It was not a short walk. It was the kind of walk one made in a carriage, wrapped in blankets, not on foot in the rain wearing a gown meant for dancing rather than distance. For a moment, she considered going back inside, to ask the host for help, to send a servant running after her husband's carriage, to make some polite excuse, and wait by the fire until another carriage could be arranged. But something stopped her. Pride, perhaps, or exhaustion, or simply the realization that she was tired of being an afterthought in her own marriage, tired of asking for things that a husband should have offered without being asked. So Eleanor lifted the hem of her gown with one hand, tightened her shawl around her shoulders with the other, and began to walk. The street lamps were few and far between on this side of the city, and their light flickered weakly through the falling rain. Eleanor kept close to the buildings, where the awnings offered some shelter, moving carefully over the uneven stones, her shoes growing heavier with each step as water seeped into the fine fabric. She passed shuttered shops and quiet houses, their windows dark, their occupants already asleep or gathered warm around evening fires. She was alone with the sound of her own footsteps and the steady patter of rain. It was strange, she thought, how clearly a person could think while walking through the cold. There was nothing to distract her out here, no music, no chatter, no need to smile politely at strangers who wished to speak with the Duke's wife rather than with her. Out here, there was only the truth, walking beside her like a silent companion. The truth was this: her marriage had become a performance, and she had grown tired of playing her part. She thought back to the early days, when she had first come to Ashworth Hall as a new bride, full of hope that affection would grow between her and the composed, dignified man she had married. She had believed, as many young women in her position believed, that respect could turn into warmth given enough time. She had waited patiently through the first year, then the second, watching her husband devote his attention to his estate, his old friendships, his social obligations, while she remained politely present but rarely truly seen. Lady Amelia Hartley had always been part of that circle of old friendships. She and Edmund had known each other since childhood, their families close for generations, and Eleanor had never thought much of it before tonight. Friendship between old acquaintances was common enough in their world. But watching him hand over the carriage so easily, without a single thought spared for his own wife, had cracked something open inside her that she had been holding together for a long time. A gust of wind pushed against her, and Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter, quickening her pace. The rain was falling harder now, and the hem of her gown was soaked through, clinging heavily to her ankles. Her feet ached inside her ruined shoes. She passed a narrow lane, where a stray cat darted for cover beneath a cart, and she envied the animal its shelter. Somewhere behind her, in the grand house she had just left, the gala was still going on. Music would still be playing. Guests would still be dancing, unaware that the Duchess of Rushden was walking alone through the rain, because her own husband had forgotten she existed. Eleanor allowed herself a small, humorless laugh at the thought. It was almost funny, in the way that painful things sometimes are. She, who wore the finest gowns in the county, who sat at the head of countless dinner tables, who was greeted with curtsies and careful respect wherever she went, was now soaked to the skin and walking home like a servant who had missed the last cart. She thought of her mother, who had warned her gently before the wedding that marriages among their class were often built on practical matters rather than affection, and that a woman's happiness would depend on her own quiet strength rather than on any promise of love. Eleanor had nodded and accepted this wisdom at the time, believing herself prepared for a marriage without deep passion. But she had not prepared herself for this particular kind of loneliness, the kind that came not from being unloved, but from being unseen. The road curved ahead of her, leading past a small square where a fountain stood silent and empty for the night. Eleanor paused there for a moment, catching her breath, resting one hand against the cold stone rim of the fountain. The rain had softened slightly, falling now in a light, steady drizzle rather than the earlier downpour, but she was already thoroughly wet, and the night air had turned her fingers numb inside her gloves. She thought about turning back, about finding some inn or friendly house where she might wait out the worst of the weather. But she was more than halfway home now, and turning back seemed as difficult as continuing forward. So she pressed on, moving past the fountain and down a narrower street lined with small shops, their shutters closed for the night. It was in front of one of these shops, a bakery with a faded sign swinging gently in the wind, that a light suddenly appeared in the window. A door opened, spilling warm yellow light onto the wet stones, and a woman's voice called out into the darkness. "Goodness, miss! Are you walking alone in this weather?" Eleanor turned, startled, to see an older woman standing in the doorway, wrapped in a woolen shawl, her gray hair pulled back beneath a simple cap. Behind her, a warm fire glowed in a small hearth, and the smell of fresh bread still lingered faintly in the air despite the late hour. "I am walking home," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady, despite the cold that had settled into her bones. "It is not much farther now." The woman studied her for a moment, taking in the fine but soaked gown, the delicate shoes never meant for such distances, the careful way Eleanor held herself despite her obvious exhaustion. Something in her expression softened with understanding, though she asked no questions about how a lady dressed for a grand evening had come to be walking alone through the rain. "Come in for a moment, at least," the woman said. "No sense catching your death out here. I've a fire going, and there's tea besides." Eleanor hesitated. Every part of her upbringing told her that a duchess did not simply step into a stranger's shop in the middle of the night, soaked and disheveled, to accept charity from a baker's wife. But another part of her, colder and wetter and more tired than she had ever been in her life, welcomed the warmth pouring out through that open door. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, and stepped inside. The shop was small but tidy, with wooden shelves lined along the walls, mostly empty at this hour except for a few loaves set aside for the morning. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Abbott, led Eleanor to a chair near the hearth and pressed a cup of hot tea into her hands before she could protest. "You'll forgive me for saying so," Mrs. Abbott said, settling into a chair across from her. "But you look like a woman who has had a difficult evening." Eleanor wrapped her cold fingers around the warm cup and allowed herself a small, tired smile. "You could say that." "Man trouble?" Mrs. Abbott asked, not unkindly, with the easy directness of someone who had raised several daughters through their own share of heartbreak. Eleanor considered lying, offering some polite excuse about a broken carriage wheel or a misunderstanding with the driver. But there was something about the warmth of the fire, the plainness of the little shop, and the kind, unassuming face of the woman across from her that made pretense feel unnecessary. "My husband forgot me," she said simply. "He gave our carriage to someone else and never thought to check whether I had a way home." Mrs. Abbott's eyebrows rose slightly, but she said nothing sharp or judgmental. Instead, she reached over and patted Eleanor's hand gently. "Well, that was thoughtless of him, whoever he is. A man ought to know where his own wife is standing before he starts handing out favors to other ladies." Eleanor laughed softly, surprised by how much lighter the sound made her feel. Yes, he ought to. They sat together for a while longer, speaking of small, unimportant things, the price of flour, the coming winter, the noisy neighbors above the shop who kept Mrs. Abbott awake some nights with their arguments. It was a simple, ordinary conversation, the kind Eleanor rarely had anymore, surrounded as she usually was by careful courtiers and watchful servants who measured every word before speaking it. Here, In this small warm shop, she was simply a tired woman drinking tea, and it felt like the first honest moment she had experienced in a very long time. When the rain outside had softened to little more than a mist, Eleanor rose and thanked Mrs. Abbott for her kindness, insisting on leaving a coin for the tea despite the woman's protests. At the door, Mrs. Abbott caught her arm gently. "Whatever is troubling you at home, miss," she said, "don't let a man's carelessness make you smaller than you are. A woman who can walk this far in the rain, and still hold her head up, has more strength in her than most people ever know." Eleanor carried those words with her as she stepped back out into the night, the rain now barely more than a fine mist against her skin. The road ahead grew more familiar with each step, the shops giving way to larger houses, the larger houses giving way, at last, to the tall iron gates of Ashworth Hall itself. She paused there for a moment, looking up at the grand stone building where warm light glowed from a few of the windows, where her husband was likely already settled by the fire, unaware of the journey she had just made. She thought of Mrs. Abbott's words, of the strength it had taken to walk this entire distance alone, and something inside her settled into a quiet, steady resolve. She would not tell him what she had endured tonight, not right away. She would let him discover it in his own time, let him wonder at the mud on her hem, and the exhaustion in her eyes. And in the space of that silence, she would begin to understand exactly what her marriage had become, and what she intended to do about it. Eleanor walked up the long drive toward the great front doors of her home, her shoes ruined, her gown soaked through, her feet aching with every step. But her back remained straight, and her chin remained lifted, and by the time she reached the doors, something in her heart had shifted permanently, though she could not yet have said exactly what it was. The night had taken something from her, but it had also given her something in return, a clarity she had not possessed before, a quiet understanding that she could survive far more than she had ever imagined, and that perhaps it was time to stop waiting for someone else to notice her worth. Inside the entrance hall of Ashworth Hall, the great clock near the staircase struck the hour, its deep chime echoing through the quiet corridors. A single footman, half asleep near the door, startled awake at the sound of it opening, and stared in confusion at the sight before him. The Duchess stood dripping on the marble floor, her elegant gown ruined beyond repair, her hair falling loose from its careful arrangement, her lips faintly blue with cold. "Your Grace," the footman stammered, rushing forward. "I did not expect—" "That is, we thought you had already returned with His Grace." "Clearly not," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the chattering of her teeth. "Please have Mrs. Dobbs bring warm water to my chambers, and see that no one disturbs the Duke with the details of my arrival tonight." The footman hesitated, clearly uncertain whether such an instruction should be followed, but something in the Duchess's expression left no room for argument. He bowed quickly and hurried off to find the housekeeper, leaving Eleanor to make her way slowly up the wide staircase alone, one hand trailing along the polished banister for support. Mrs. Dobbs, the housekeeper, met her at the top of the stairs only minutes later, her face creased with worry beneath her white cap. She had served the Ashworth family for over 20 years, and had grown fond of the young Duchess in the years since her arrival, often the only person in the household who seemed to notice when something troubled her mistress. "Your Grace, you are soaked through," Mrs. Dobbs said, already reaching for a warm shawl from a nearby linen chest. "Whatever happened? Did the carriage break down?" "I walked home, Mrs. Dobbs," Eleanor said simply, too tired now for anything but plain truth. "The Duke gave our carriage to Lady Amelia Hartley, and I found my own way back." Mrs. Dobbs's mouth tightened into a thin line, though she said nothing improper about her employer. Instead, she wrapped the shawl carefully around Eleanor's shoulders and guided her toward her chambers, calling softly for a maid to bring hot water and dry linens. "You ought to have sent word ahead somehow, Your Grace," Mrs. Dobbs said gently, helping Eleanor out of her ruined gown once they reached the privacy of her rooms. "There is no shame in asking for help when help is needed." "I know," Eleanor admitted, sinking gratefully into a chair near the fire that had already been lit for the evening. "But tonight, I did not wish to ask. I wished to see how far I could carry myself, without depending on anyone else." Mrs. Dobbs said nothing more on the matter, though her expression suggested she understood far more than she let on. She worked quietly and efficiently, helping Eleanor into a warm nightgown, brushing out her damp hair, and settling a hot brick wrapped in cloth near her feet, to chase away the last of the evening's chill. By the time the housekeeper finally withdrew, promising to check on her mistress again before retiring herself. Eleanor felt something close to human again, though the ache in her chest remained far harder to soothe than the ache in her feet. She did not sleep easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the image of her husband handing Lady Amelia into the carriage, saw the easy warmth in his manner toward another woman that he so rarely showed toward his own wife. She turned the memory over and over in her mind, searching for some innocent explanation, some reasonable excuse that might soften the sting of it. But no matter how she examined it, the truth remained the same. He had not thought of her at all. It was nearly dawn when Eleanor finally drifted into a restless sleep, and it was well past midday when she woke again, the winter sun slanting weakly through the curtains of her chamber. For a moment, lying there in the quiet warmth of her bed, she almost forgot the events of the previous night. But then her gaze fell upon the ruined gown, draped over a chair where Mrs. Dobbs had left it to dry, and the memory returned in full, heavy, and unwelcome. Edmund had returned home sometime after midnight, well after Eleanor had already retired, still pleased with himself for what he considered a small act of gallantry toward an old family friend. He had gone straight to his own chambers, assuming, as he always assumed, that his wife had returned safely and comfortably, in whatever arrangement had been made for her. It did not occur to him to check. It rarely occurred to him to check on much of anything regarding Eleanor's comfort, not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of careless habit built over years of a marriage that had settled into polite, distant routine. He learned the truth only the following morning, quite by accident, when he overheard two maids whispering in the hallway outside his study, their voices low but not quite low enough. "Poor Duchess, walking all that way in the rain," one maid murmured to the other. "Ruined her best silk shoes, they say. Mrs. Dobbs had to throw them out entirely. And her gown besides," the other replied, "soaked clean through by the time she reached the house. I heard she looked half frozen." Edmund froze in the corridor, his hand still resting on the door of his study, as the words settled over him like cold water. He had assumed, without ever confirming it, that Eleanor had taken some other arrangement home, perhaps traveling with one of the other noble families who had also attended the gala. The possibility that she had walked, alone, through the rain, for the better part of an hour, while he sat comfortably in his own carriage, congratulating himself on his kindness toward Lady Amelia, had simply never crossed his mind. He dismissed the maids quickly, his voice sharper than he intended, and made his way directly to Eleanor's chambers, his earlier confidence now replaced by a growing unease. He knocked, waited, and when no answer came, knocked again, before finally opening the door, to find the room empty, the bed already made, Eleanor nowhere in sight. It was Mrs. Dobbs who found him standing there, confusion, and something like guilt beginning to shadow his features. "Her Grace has gone down to the garden, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her tone carefully neutral, though there was a certain coolness in her manner that Edmund, in his years as her employer, had rarely encountered before. "She said she wished for some fresh air." "Mrs. Dobbs," Edmund said slowly, "is it true that my wife walked home last night?" The housekeeper's expression did not soften. "It is true, Your Grace. All the way from the Whitfield townhouse, in the rain, with no escort and no carriage. She arrived here well past midnight, soaked through and shivering." Edmund felt something cold settle in his chest, a feeling he did not immediately recognize because it had been so long since he had felt truly ashamed of himself. He thanked the housekeeper quietly and made his way down through the house toward the garden, his mind working through the events of the previous evening in a new and uncomfortable light. He found Eleanor sitting on a stone bench near the rose beds, wrapped in a heavy cloak against the cold, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the garden wall. She did not turn when she heard his footsteps approaching, though she must have known it was him by the particular rhythm of his walk, familiar to her after years of marriage. "Eleanor," he said, stopping a short distance away, uncertain suddenly how to begin. "Good afternoon, Edmund," she replied, her voice pleasant, but distant, the voice she used with acquaintances, rather than the voice she had once used with him in their earliest, more hopeful days together. "I heard," he said carefully, "that you walked home last night. Is this true?" "It is. Why did you not send word? Why did you not ask someone for help, or wait for me to notice you were missing?" At this, Eleanor finally turned to look at him, and something in her expression made him wish, briefly, that she had not. There was no anger there, no dramatic accusation, only a tired, clear-eyed honesty that felt far heavier than any temper might have been. "I did wait, Edmund," she said quietly. "I waited for you to notice, the way I have waited for you to notice a great many things over the years. But you did not look for me. You gave our carriage to Lady Amelia, without so much as glancing around, to see where your own wife might be standing." Edmund opened his mouth to protest, to explain that he had simply assumed she was already gone, that it had never occurred to him she might be stranded, that Amelia had seemed distressed, and he had acted out of simple courtesy rather than any deeper preference. But the words felt hollow even as he considered them, and he found himself closing his mouth again, unable to offer any excuse that did not sound, even to his own ears, like precisely the kind of thoughtless habit Eleanor was describing. "I am sorry," he said finally, the words feeling strange and unfamiliar in his mouth, as though he had not used them in this particular way for a very long time. "I did not think. I should have thought, and I did not, and I am sorry for the discomfort it caused you." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, searching his face for something, though what exactly she was searching for, Edmund could not have said. Whatever she found there did not seem to satisfy her entirely, though it did not seem to anger her further either. "It is not only about last night, Edmund," she said finally, rising from the bench and gathering her cloak more closely around her shoulders. "But I do not wish to discuss the rest of it just now. I am tired, and my feet still ache from the walk." She left him standing alone in the garden, the cold winter air settling around him as he watched her retreat back toward the house, and for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, Edmund found himself truly wondering what exactly his wife meant by the rest of it, and how long she had been carrying whatever burden those words implied. That evening, he ate dinner alone in the great dining hall, Eleanor having sent word that she preferred to take a tray in her chambers, and he found himself turning over the events of the past day with an unfamiliar, uncomfortable attentiveness. He thought back over the years of their marriage, searching his memory for other moments when he might have overlooked her, other small carelessnesses that had accumulated, unnoticed by him, into whatever weight now sat behind her tired, guarded eyes. He remembered, with some discomfort, the many evenings he had spent in his study, discussing estate matters with old friends, while Eleanor sat alone in the drawing room. He remembered the times he had traveled to visit distant relations without thinking to ask whether she might wish to accompany him. He remembered, too, the particular ease with which he had always spoken to Lady Amelia, an ease born of childhood familiarity, that he had never quite managed to extend toward the woman he had actually married. None of these things, taken alone, seemed like grave offenses. But taken together, gathered over years of quiet accumulation, Edmund began to understand, slowly and reluctantly, that he might have built a marriage founded on convenience and habit rather than genuine attention, and that his wife, whom he had always considered reasonably content in her position, might in fact have been growing more distant from him with every overlooked moment. It was not a comfortable realization, and Edmund was not a man who enjoyed discomfort of this particular kind. But something about the image of Eleanor walking alone through the rain, her fine shoes ruined, her gown soaked through, refusing even to ask for help rather than depend further on a husband who had already failed her that evening, lodged itself firmly in his mind and refused to be dismissed. He resolved, sitting alone at the long dining table with his food growing cold before him, that he would need to understand exactly what had gone wrong in his marriage, and more importantly, whether there remained any way to repair it. To understand how a marriage arrives at such a place, one must look back to how it began. Edmund and Eleanor had married 5 years earlier, in a match arranged carefully between two respected families who valued land, title, and reputation, above the more uncertain matter of affection. Eleanor's father, a baron of modest but respectable standing, had been eager to secure such an advantageous connection for his daughter, and Edmund, still young in his role as duke following his own father's passing, had been encouraged by his advisers to marry quickly and suitably in order to settle his household affairs. Neither of them had objected strongly to the arrangement. Eleanor had been raised to expect a marriage of practical benefit rather than romantic passion, and she had approached her wedding day with cautious hope rather than any grand expectation of love. Edmund, for his part, had found Eleanor perfectly agreeable during their brief courtship, a quiet, intelligent young woman who seemed unlikely to cause difficulty or scandal, which was, in his mind at the time, a reasonable enough foundation upon which to build a household. In the earliest months of their marriage, there had been moments of genuine warmth between them. Edmund had taken care to show Eleanor around the grand halls of Ashworth, had introduced her proudly to his closest friends and family, had even, on occasion, sought out her opinion on matters of estate management, with what seemed like real interest. Eleanor had begun to allow herself small hopes during this period, small imaginings of a future where mutual respect might slowly deepen into something warmer. But as the months passed into years, the demands of Edmund's position gradually consumed more and more of his attention. There were tenant disputes to settle, investments to oversee, political alliances to maintain through careful correspondence, and occasional travel to the capital. Edmund threw himself into these responsibilities with the same steady dedication he applied to everything in his life, and slowly, without any deliberate unkindness, Eleanor found herself pushed further to the edges of his daily concerns. It was not that he was cruel to her. He was never harsh, never neglectful in any obvious or dramatic way. He provided generously for her comfort, ensured she wanted for nothing material, and treated her always with polite, distant courtesy. But courtesy, Eleanor had come to understand over the years, was a poor substitute for genuine attention, and politeness could feel, over time, almost as isolating as outright coldness. Lady Amelia Hartley had remained a constant presence throughout these years, her family's estate bordering Ashworth's own lands, her friendship with Edmund stretching back to childhood summers spent together before either of them had any thought of marriage or duty. Eleanor had never seriously suspected any improper feeling between them, understanding well enough the particular ease that could develop between old friends who had known each other since youth. But she had noticed, in 100 small ways over the years, the difference in how Edmund spoke to Amelia compared to how he spoke to her. With Amelia, he laughed more easily, he listened more attentively to her opinions on trivial matters, teased her gently about old memories they shared, seemed genuinely curious about the small details of her daily life. With Eleanor, his conversation remained pleasant but careful, as though he were speaking with a respected colleague rather than a wife he had chosen to spend his life beside. She had told herself, for years, that this was simply the nature of old friendship compared to arranged marriage, that such things could not be forced or manufactured through sheer will alone. But watching him hand over their carriage so easily on that rainy night, without a single thought spared for her own comfort, had finally cracked open the careful acceptance she had built around this particular sorrow. Eleanor remembered, too, a smaller incident from perhaps 2 years earlier, one she had almost forgotten, until the events of the carriage brought it rushing back to mind. She had fallen ill with a persistent fever during a particularly harsh winter, confined to her bed for nearly 2 weeks while the household physician monitored her recovery. Edmund had visited her chambers dutifully each evening, inquiring politely after her health, but he had also continued attending his usual social engagements throughout her illness, including several evenings spent at gatherings where Lady Amelia was also present. At the time, Eleanor had told herself this was simply the necessary continuation of his duties as Duke, that he could hardly cancel every social obligation on account of a wife's temporary illness. But some small, honest part of her had wondered, even then, whether a husband who truly cherished his wife might have found reason to stay closer to home during such a time. These small moments, gathered together over years of quiet accumulation, formed the foundation of the distance that now existed between them, a distance that neither had ever directly acknowledged until the events of the rainy carriage forced the matter into the open. Eleanor had grown skilled, over the years, at managing her own disappointment quietly, at finding contentment in the smaller pleasures available to her, her correspondence with old friends, her management of the household accounts, the quiet hours spent reading in the extensive Ashworth library. She had built, without quite realizing it, an entire private world separate from her marriage, a world where she did not need to depend on her husband's attention for her own sense of purpose or worth. It was this private world, this quiet independence built slowly, over years of gentle neglect, that gave her the strength to walk home alone, through the rain, rather than wait helplessly for rescue. And it was this same independence that now made her hesitant to simply forgive and forget when Edmund finally began to show signs of genuine remorse over his carelessness. In the days following their brief conversation in the garden, Edmund found himself observing his wife with a new and unfamiliar attentiveness. He noticed, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, the particular way she preferred her tea prepared. The specific arrangement of books she kept beside her favorite chair in the library, the small habits and preferences that had apparently developed and settled into place around him without his ever truly noticing them. It was a humbling experience, discovering how little he actually knew about the daily rhythms of the woman he had shared a home with for 5 years. He began, tentatively, to seek out small opportunities to spend time in her company, joining her for tea in the afternoons, rather than retreating immediately to his study, asking after her opinion on household matters, with what he hoped was genuine, rather than merely polite curiosity. Eleanor received these overtures with careful, measured courtesy, neither rebuffing him entirely, nor offering the warm encouragement that might have suggested she had already forgiven the accumulated years of quiet neglect. Their household staff, meanwhile, had not remained ignorant of the tension now simmering beneath the surface of the Ashworth marriage. Mrs. Dobbs, in particular, watched the careful dance between her employers with a mixture of hope and concern, having witnessed enough of the quiet distance between them over the years to understand that a single apology, however sincerely offered, was unlikely to resolve difficulties that had been building for so long. She said nothing directly to either of them, understanding her place well enough to know when discretion served better than intervention, but she made certain that small comforts appeared in Eleanor's chambers without being asked for, and that Edmund's meals arrived with particular care whenever he seemed occupied with troubled thoughts. It was into this delicate, uncertain atmosphere that the first whispers of gossip began to arrive from the wider circles of society, whispers that would soon complicate matters considerably beyond the private difficulties already existing between husband and wife. News of the incident at the Whitfield Gala traveled quickly through the drawing rooms and card tables of society, as such stories always did among a class of people with abundant leisure time and a considerable appetite for the misfortunes of others. By the time Eleanor attended her next social engagement, a smaller gathering hosted by her longtime friend Charlotte Bennet, the story of the Duke's careless gift of the family carriage had already been embellished considerably beyond its original simple facts. "They say she walked 5 miles in the rain," one lady whispered to another, as Eleanor passed near a cluster of chairs arranged near the fireplace, apparently unaware, or uncaring, that the subject of their conversation stood close enough to overhear. "I heard she caught a terrible chill afterward," another voice added, "and that the Duke did not even notice for 2 full days." Eleanor kept her expression carefully composed as she made her way toward Charlotte, who greeted her with a warm embrace and a sympathetic squeeze of the hand that suggested she, too, had heard the rumors circulating through their social circle. "Pay them no mind," Charlotte murmured once they had settled into a quieter corner of the room, away from the worst of the whispering crowds. "You know how these stories grow larger with each retelling." "I know," Eleanor said, accepting a cup of tea from a passing servant. "Though in this particular case, I am afraid the essential facts require little embellishment." Charlotte's eyebrows rose with concern. "Then it is true? He truly gave your carriage away and left you to walk home alone?" "He did," Eleanor confirmed, keeping her voice low, "though I do not believe he intended any real unkindness by it. He simply did not think of me at all, which is perhaps a worse failing than deliberate cruelty might have been." Charlotte, who had known Eleanor since their earliest years and understood the particular texture of her friend's marriage better than most, reached over and pressed her hand gently. "You deserve better than a husband who forgets your presence so easily, my dear. Whatever you decide to do about it, know that you have my support." The gossip, unfortunately, did not remain confined to sympathetic whispers among Eleanor's own acquaintances. Within Edmund's circles, a rather different and more troubling version of the story began to circulate, one that suggested improper feelings existing between the Duke and Lady Amelia Hartley, feelings that supposedly explained his careless disregard for his own wife's comfort. Such rumors, once begun, proved remarkably difficult to extinguish, particularly given the long history of friendship between Edmund and Amelia that provided fertile ground for speculation. Lady Priscilla Vane, a woman well known throughout society for her sharp tongue and considerable talent for spreading interesting stories, took particular delight in elaborating upon the tale wherever she found a willing audience. "One does wonder," she remarked pointedly, during a card game attended by several prominent families, "what precisely occupies the Duke's attention so thoroughly that he forgets his own wife exists. Old friendships can grow into rather warmer feelings than one might expect, particularly when a marriage lacks genuine affection to begin with. Word of such comments inevitably reached both Edmund and Eleanor, adding a new and uncomfortable dimension to their already delicate situation. Edmund, upon hearing the rumors, grew genuinely alarmed, understanding immediately the damage such speculation might cause, not only to his own reputation, but to Lady Amelia's as well, a woman whose only true offense had been accepting a kind gesture during an inconvenient rainstorm. He sought out Eleanor one evening in the library, finding her seated near the fire with a book resting unread in her lap, her gaze fixed instead on the dancing flames. "You have heard the rumors, I assume," he said, settling into the chair opposite her without waiting for an invitation. "I have," Eleanor replied, closing her book and setting it aside. "Lady Vane has been most thorough in her retelling, I understand. There is nothing improper between myself and Lady Amelia," Edmund said firmly. "I would not wish for you to believe such things, whatever else you may think of my carelessness that evening." "I have never believed there was anything improper between you," Eleanor said, and Edmund noted with some relief that she seemed to speak honestly, rather than merely offering polite reassurance. "Your fault, Edmund, was never infidelity. It was inattention. Those are different failings, though society seems determined to conflate the two in this particular case." "Then how do we address it?" Edmund asked, genuine frustration coloring his voice for the first time since the incident had occurred. "I cannot simply announce to every drawing room in the city that my marriage suffers from neglect rather than betrayal. Such an admission would hardly improve matters." Eleanor considered this for a long moment before answering. "Perhaps the answer is not in what we announce to others, but in what we actually do differently between ourselves. Rumors feed on uncertainty and unhappiness, Edmund. If our own household reflected genuine warmth and attention, I suspect the gossip would find less fertile ground to grow in." It was sound advice, though Edmund found it considerably more difficult to act upon than to hear spoken aloud. Years of habitual distance could not be undone through simple determination alone, and both he and Eleanor found themselves navigating an unfamiliar and somewhat awkward territory as they attempted to build something warmer between them than the polite courtesy that had defined their marriage for so long. Eleanor, for her part, used this period of uncertain transition to further develop the independence she had begun quietly cultivating over the preceding years. She took on greater responsibility for managing the Ashworth household accounts, a task she discovered she possessed considerable aptitude for, much to the surprise of the estate's longtime steward, who had assumed such matters lay entirely beyond a lady's proper concern. She renewed her correspondence with distant relations she had allowed to lapse during the busier years of managing her household duties, and she began accompanying Charlotte on regular visits to a charitable institution supporting widowed women and their children, work that gave her a growing sense of purpose, separate from her identity as the Duke's wife. These pursuits did not represent any deliberate attempt to punish Edmund or to demonstrate her ability to thrive without his attention, though he could hardly help noticing the growing confidence and purpose she carried in her daily bearing. Rather, they represented Eleanor's genuine effort to build a fuller, more satisfying life for herself, one that no longer depended entirely upon whether her husband chose to notice her presence in any given moment. Edmund watched these developments with a complicated mixture of admiration and something uncomfortably close to jealousy, though he recognized the unfairness of resenting his wife's growing independence when his own years of inattention had created the very conditions that necessitated it. He found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, genuinely impressed by her handling of the household accounts, by the thoughtful correspondence she maintained with relations he had barely remembered existed, by the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, despite the ongoing whispers of society. It was during this period of gradual, uncertain change that Lady Amelia Hartley, growing increasingly uncomfortable with the rumors swirling around her own reputation, made the decision to speak directly with Eleanor, hoping to clear the air between them before matters grew any more complicated. She called upon Eleanor one afternoon, finding her in the garden overseeing the pruning of the rose bushes in preparation for the coming spring. Eleanor greeted her with careful but genuine politeness, and the two women settled onto a stone bench together, the autumn air crisp but not unpleasant around them. "I wish to speak with you directly," Amelia began, her hands folded nervously in her lap, "regarding the unfortunate rumors that have been circulating since the Whitfield Gala. I would not have you believe that I sought any special attention from your husband that evening, nor that any improper feeling exists between us." Eleanor studied the other woman for a long moment before responding. "I have never doubted your intentions, Lady Amelia, I know well enough the nature of your friendship with Edmund, and I have never suspected it to be anything other than what it appears, a long and comfortable acquaintance dating back to childhood. Relief flooded visibly across Amelia's features. I am glad to hear you say so. I have felt terrible guilt over the situation, understanding that my acceptance of the carriage that evening caused you such difficulty and discomfort, however unintentionally. The fault was never truly yours, Eleanor said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant the words sincerely. Edmund's carelessness that evening reflected a pattern that existed long before you ever stepped into his carriage. You simply happened to be present on the particular evening when I finally decided I would no longer accept it silently. The two women spoke for some time longer, and by the conclusion of their conversation, a cautious but genuine understanding had developed between them, one built on honest acknowledgement rather than polite pretense. Amelia departed with a clearer conscience, and Eleanor found herself, somewhat unexpectedly, in possession of a new and unlikely ally in her efforts to reshape the terms of her marriage. The gossip, deprived of the scandalous romantic angle that had made it so compelling to society's most enthusiastic storytellers, gradually began to lose its momentum, replaced soon enough by newer and more interesting subjects of conversation among the fashionable circles of the city. But the private questions raised within Eleanor's own marriage remained very much unresolved, awaiting the more difficult conversation that both she and Edmund had, until now, managed to avoid. The conversation that would finally address the full weight of the matter arrived on a quiet evening, several weeks after the incident at the Whitfield Gala, when the last of the gossip had finally faded from the drawing rooms of society, and the household at Ashworth Hall had settled into a strange, uncertain rhythm of careful politeness, layered over unspoken tension. Edmund found Eleanor in the small sitting room adjoining her private chambers, a space she had claimed for herself over the years, as somewhere she could read and write correspondence away from the more formal areas of the great house. She looked up from her letters as he entered, her expression polite but guarded, the same careful distance she had maintained with him since the night of the carriage. "I have been thinking," Edmund said, closing the door behind him and taking a seat across from her without waiting for invitation, "that we cannot continue indefinitely in this manner, speaking to each other as though we were merely polite acquaintances sharing a house rather than husband and wife." Eleanor set down her pen carefully, giving him her full attention. "What manner would you prefer instead, Edmund?" "I would prefer honesty," he said, and something in his voice suggested he had rehearsed this conversation many times in his mind before finally working up the courage to begin it. "You said, in the garden that first afternoon, that the carriage was not the only matter troubling you. I would like to hear the rest of it now, whatever it may be, and however difficult it may be for either of us to say aloud." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing whether he was truly prepared to hear what she might say, or whether he simply wished for reassurance that would allow them both to move past the discomfort of the preceding weeks without genuine change. Something in his expression, a kind of steady, uncomfortable determination she had rarely seen from him before, convinced her that he was, at least in this moment, genuinely prepared to listen. "Very well," she said finally. "Since you have asked for honesty, I shall give it to you, though I warn you it may not be pleasant to hear. I understand." Eleanor rose from her chair and walked slowly to the window, looking out over the darkening garden below as she gathered her thoughts. "When we married, Edmund, I did not expect passion between us. I understood the practical nature of our arrangement, and I accepted it willingly enough, believing that respect and companionship might grow between us over time, even without the deeper affection that poets and novelists write so extensively about." "And did such respect not grow?" Edmund asked, a note of genuine uncertainty in his voice. "Some measure of it did, certainly," Eleanor acknowledged. "But respect alone cannot sustain a marriage indefinitely, Edmund, not when it exists alongside constant, quiet neglect. You have never been cruel to me. You have never raised your voice against me or treated me with anything other than surface courtesy. But courtesy is not the same as attention, and attention is not the same as genuine care." She turned from the window to face him directly. "Do you know, Edmund, that you have never once asked me what I hope for in my own life, separate from my role as your wife? Do you know that in 5 years of marriage, you have never inquired about the books I prefer to read, or the causes I care about, or the dreams I once held before I understood that such things were considered impractical for a woman in my position?" Edmund shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unable to meet her gaze directly. I confess I have not asked such questions, no. And yet you speak so easily with Lady Amelia about such matters, Eleanor continued, though her tone remained more sorrowful than accusatory. I have watched you, over the years, laugh with her about shared memories. Listen attentively to her opinions on matters both trivial and important. Show genuine curiosity about the details of her daily life. I do not believe there is any impropriety between you, Edmund. But I have wondered, many times, why such easy warmth exists so naturally with an old friend, while your own wife receives only careful politeness. The words landed with considerable force, and Edmund found himself unable to offer any immediate defense, understanding with growing discomfort the truth contained within her observation. He had, indeed, always found conversation with Amelia effortless, in a way that his interactions with Eleanor had never quite managed to become, though he had never before examined why this might be so, or what it revealed about the priorities he had unconsciously established within his own marriage. I did not marry Amelia, he said finally, though even as he spoke the words, he recognized their inadequacy as any real answer to Eleanor's concerns. I married you. Yes, Eleanor said quietly, you did marry me. But marrying someone, and truly seeing them, are apparently two very different things, Edmund, and I have spent 5 years being married without being seen. The weight of this statement settled heavily over the room, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound the soft crackling of the fire, and the distant murmur of servants moving through the corridors below. Edmund finally rose from his chair, and crossed to where Eleanor stood near the window, though he stopped a respectful distance away, uncertain whether closer contact would be welcomed or resented in this particular moment. I do not know how to properly apologize for years of carelessness. I did not even recognize I was committing, he said finally. But I would like the opportunity to try to correct it, if you are willing to allow me that chance. Eleanor considered him carefully, searching his face for the same sincerity she had detected earlier, when he had first asked her to speak honestly about her concerns. I am not opposed to trying, Edmund. But I will not accept empty gestures or grand romantic displays, meant to quickly smooth over years of accumulated neglect. If you truly wish to change the nature of our marriage, it must be through consistent, genuine attention, not through occasional dramatic apologies, followed by a return to old habits. I understand, Edmund said, and this time, his voice carried none of the earlier uncertainty, replaced instead by a steady resolve that Eleanor found, cautiously, somewhat reassuring. I cannot promise perfection, Eleanor. I have spent 5 years building certain habits of thought and behavior, and I imagine some of them will prove difficult to unlearn. But I can promise genuine effort, and I would ask only that you extend some measure of patience while I make that effort, understanding that change of this nature rarely happens quickly or without occasional setbacks. It was not a perfect resolution, nor did either of them expect it to immediately transform the careful distance that had grown between them over years of quiet neglect. But it represented, for the first time in longer than either of them could easily remember, a genuine and honest acknowledgement of the difficulties within their marriage, spoken aloud rather than carefully avoided through polite silence. Eleanor found herself, in the days that followed this difficult conversation, cautiously observing whether Edmund's stated intentions would translate into any meaningful change in his actual behavior, understanding well enough from her own experience that good intentions, however sincerely felt in the moment, did not always survive contact with the accumulated habits of years past. The weeks that followed brought a series of small, deliberate changes to the daily rhythm of Ashworth Hall, changes so gradual that any single one of them might have gone unnoticed on its own, but which together began to reshape the texture of the marriage between Edmund and Eleanor in ways neither had quite anticipated. Edmund began joining Eleanor each morning for breakfast, a habit they had abandoned years earlier, in favor of separate schedules that better accommodated his early meetings with the estate steward and her preference for a slower start to the day. Rather than simply exchanging pleasantries over the meal, he made a genuine effort to ask about her plans for the day, to inquire after the progress of her charitable work with Charlotte, to listen with real attention when she described the details of the household accounts she now managed with growing confidence. At first, these conversations felt somewhat forced and awkward to both of them, the natural result of attempting to build a habit that had never previously existed between them. Edmund found himself uncertain what questions might genuinely interest Eleanor, rather than simply serve as polite conversation, and Eleanor, for her part, remained cautious about sharing too much of herself too quickly, wary of being disappointed once again, should his newfound attentiveness prove temporary. But gradually, almost despite themselves, the conversations began to feel more natural. Edmund discovered, to his genuine surprise, that Eleanor possessed a sharp and thoughtful mind regarding matters of household management, offering suggestions for improving the estate's efficiency that even his longtime steward acknowledged as valuable. He found himself genuinely curious about her opinions, rather than merely tolerant of them, and this shift in his own attitude did not go unnoticed by Eleanor, who began, cautiously, to share more of her thoughts and observations during their morning conversations. Edmund also made a point of accompanying Eleanor to social engagements he had previously attended alone, or with only minimal regard for her presence beside him. At a dinner party hosted by Lord Barrington several weeks after their difficult conversation, Edmund remained close to Eleanor throughout the evening, introducing her thoughtfully to guests she had not previously met, drawing her into conversations, rather than allowing her to remain quietly at the periphery, while he engaged with his own circle of acquaintances. When Lady Priscilla Vane, ever eager to stir renewed interest in old gossip, made a pointed comment during the evening about the Duke's supposed carelessness toward his wife's comfort, Edmund responded with a firm and immediate defense of Eleanor that surprised several of the guests present, accustomed as they were to his usual polite indifference regarding such matters. "My wife's comfort is my primary concern," he said simply, his tone leaving little room for further discussion on the matter. "Whatever difficulties may have existed between us in the past, I assure you they are being addressed with the seriousness they deserve." Eleanor, standing beside him, felt a small but genuine warmth at hearing him speak so directly in her defense, a warmth she had not experienced in longer than she cared to admit. She recognized, of course, that a single defensive comment at a dinner party did not undo years of accumulated neglect, but she also recognized the genuine effort behind such a public statement, an effort that would have been entirely unlike the Edmund she had known before the events of the rainy carriage. Edmund also began to make smaller, more private gestures that spoke to a growing attentiveness toward Eleanor's actual preferences rather than generic assumptions about what a wife might appreciate. He noticed, during their morning conversations, that she often mentioned a particular author whose works she enjoyed, and he arranged, without any great fanfare, for several new volumes by this author to be added to the library shelves nearest her favorite reading chair. He noticed her preference for a particular blend of tea, previously overlooked amid the household's standard offerings, and quietly instructed the kitchen staff to ensure it remained available whenever she wished for it. These gestures, small as they were, carried considerable weight, precisely because of their specificity, demonstrating an attentiveness to Eleanor's particular preferences, rather than the generic, interchangeable courtesy he had extended toward her throughout most of their marriage. Eleanor noticed each small change, and while she remained careful not to allow herself excessive hope too quickly, she found herself gradually softening toward her husband in ways that surprised her. Not every attempt at change proceeded smoothly, however, and both Edmund and Eleanor experienced moments of frustration and setback as they navigated the unfamiliar territory of genuine partnership after years of comfortable distance. On one occasion, Edmund departed for a 2-day journey to settle a boundary dispute with a neighboring estate without properly informing Eleanor of his travel plans in advance, an oversight that reminded her uncomfortably of the old patterns of thoughtlessness that had characterized their earlier years together. When he returned, he found Eleanor considerably more guarded than she had been in recent weeks, and it took a genuine, humbling apology on his part, along with a clear explanation of how he intended to better communicate his plans going forward, before the warmth between them began to return. Edmund learned, through this and other similar small missteps, that rebuilding genuine trust required not perfection, but consistent effort and honest acknowledgement whenever old habits threatened to reassert themselves. Lady Amelia Hartley, meanwhile, having established a cautious but genuine friendship with Eleanor following their earlier conversation in the garden, began to notice the gradual changes taking place within the Ashworth marriage during her occasional visits to the estate. She mentioned as much to Eleanor during one such visit, the two women having settled into a comfortable habit of taking tea together every few weeks. "Edmund seems different lately," Amelia observed, stirring a small amount of sugar into her tea. "More attentive, somehow, than I have seen him in recent years." "He is trying," Eleanor said simply, though a small smile played at the corners of her mouth as she spoke. Whether the effort will prove lasting remains to be seen, but I confess, I have been cautiously encouraged by what I have observed so far. I am glad to hear it, Amelia said sincerely. You deserve a marriage built on genuine warmth, Eleanor, whatever the circumstances of its beginning may have been. Eleanor found herself, in these quiet months of gradual change, developing a genuine friendship with the very woman whose presence had first exposed the depth of neglect within her marriage, a development that struck her, when she considered it, as one of the more unexpected outcomes of the entire painful episode. Rather than resentment or jealousy, she found herself grateful, in an odd way, for the incident that had finally forced both her and Edmund to confront the quiet distance that had grown between them over years of comfortable, but ultimately unsatisfying routine. By the time winter began to soften into the first tentative signs of spring, Eleanor found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, genuinely looking forward to her morning conversations with Edmund, genuinely curious about his own thoughts and concerns, rather than merely tolerant of his company out of duty and habit. The marriage that had once felt like a careful performance of mutual courtesy had begun to develop into something that more closely resembled genuine partnership, built slowly and deliberately, through consistent attention, rather than any single dramatic gesture. But Eleanor remained aware, even as she allowed herself to feel this cautious hope, that true change would only be proven through time and continued consistency, and she watched carefully for the moment when Edmund's genuine growth might be tested by circumstances similar to those that had originally exposed his careless neglect. That test arrived sooner than either of them expected, in the form of an invitation to a grand spring gathering, hosted once again at the Whitfield townhouse, the very same location where the original incident with the carriage had taken place months earlier. Eleanor felt a flicker of old anxiety upon receiving the invitation, memories of that cold, rainy walk home, returning unbidden, as she considered attending an event held in the same house where her husband's carelessness had first been so clearly revealed. She mentioned this hesitation to Edmund during one of their now regular morning conversations, uncertain whether he would understand the particular weight the location carried for her. "We need not attend if it troubles you," Edmund said immediately, setting down his teacup to give her his full attention. "I can send our regrets easily enough." "No," Eleanor said after a moment's consideration. "I think perhaps we should attend, not to relive old wounds, but to prove to ourselves that we have genuinely moved beyond them." Edmund studied her carefully, understanding the significance of what she proposed. "Very well. But I promise you, Eleanor, that whatever happens at this gathering, you will not find yourself standing alone in the rain, waiting for a carriage that never comes." The evening of the gathering arrived with clear skies, a small mercy that Eleanor noted with quiet relief as their carriage made its way toward the Whitfield townhouse. The house looked much as it had months earlier, warmly lit windows glowing against the darkening sky, elegant carriages already lining the drive as other guests arrived for the evening's festivities. Throughout the gathering, Edmund remained close to Eleanor's side in a manner that felt entirely different from the distant courtesy that had characterized similar events in years past. He introduced her enthusiastically to new acquaintances, sought her opinion openly during discussions of estate matters and political developments, and made no move throughout the entire evening to separate himself into conversations that excluded her presence. When Lady Amelia Hartley arrived partway through the evening, greeting both Edmund and Eleanor with genuine warmth born of their now established friendship, there was none of the old tension or careful avoidance that might once have characterized such an encounter. The three of them spoke together easily for a time, discussing a charitable initiative that Eleanor and Amelia had recently begun organizing together to support widowed women in the surrounding countryside. Edmund, listening, with what appeared to be genuine interest, and even offering some practical suggestions regarding funding arrangements that might benefit the cause. As the evening drew toward its natural conclusion, and guests began preparing for their departures, Edmund excused himself briefly from a conversation with Lord Barrington regarding upcoming political matters, making his way instead directly to where Eleanor stood, speaking with Charlotte near the entrance hall. "Our carriage should be ready," he said, offering her his arm. "Shall we?" The simple gesture carried enormous weight, given the history between them, and Eleanor felt a genuine warmth spread through her chest as she accepted his offered arm, allowing him to guide her through the crowd of departing guests toward the front entrance. Several other ladies stood waiting near the doorway for their own transportation, including, Eleanor noticed with a small private smile, a woman whose own husband seemed entirely absorbed in conversation with a group of gentlemen nearby, apparently unconcerned with his wife's need for escort. Edmund walked Eleanor directly to their waiting carriage, opening the door himself despite the presence of their own driver ready to perform this small service, and helped her inside with careful attention before climbing in beside her. As the carriage pulled away from the Whitfield townhouse, retracing in reverse the very route Eleanor had once walked alone through pouring rain, she found herself watching the familiar streets pass by the window with an entirely different feeling than the cold, exhausted misery of that earlier night.
"Thank you,"
she said quietly, turning to look at Edmund beside her. "For what precisely?" he asked, though something in his expression suggested he understood well enough what she meant. "For remembering me tonight," she said simply. "For making certain I was not left standing alone, wondering whether you had thought of me at all." Edmund reached over and took her hand gently in his own, an intimate gesture that would have felt entirely foreign between them only months earlier, but which now seemed to arrive naturally from the genuine warmth that had slowly grown between them through weeks and months of deliberate, consistent attention. "I intend to remember you every day going forward, Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that left no room for doubt regarding his intentions. "Not out of guilt over past carelessness, but because I have come to genuinely treasure your company and your partnership in ways I foolishly overlooked for far too many years." Eleanor allowed herself, in that quiet moment inside the gently swaying carriage, to fully believe in the possibility of genuine happiness within her marriage, not because Edmund had offered any single grand romantic gesture, but because he had demonstrated, through months of consistent small actions, a genuine commitment to seeing her clearly and valuing her presence in his daily life. The carriage arrived at Ashworth Hall well before midnight, the journey home feeling remarkably shorter than the long, cold walk Eleanor remembered from months earlier. As they climbed the front steps together, Edmund's hand resting lightly at the small of her back in a gesture of quiet, protective affection, Eleanor glanced back toward the road they had just traveled, thinking briefly of the woman she had been on that rainy night, exhausted and heartbroken, but determined to carry herself with dignity despite her husband's thoughtlessness. That woman had survived the walk home through sheer strength of will, discovering in the process a resilience and independence she had not previously recognized in herself. And though Eleanor would never wish to repeat the pain of that particular evening, she found herself, standing now at the doorway of her home, beside a husband who had genuinely worked to become deserving of her trust, grateful in some strange way for the painful clarity that walk had provided. It had taken a cold, rainy night and a long, lonely journey on foot to finally reveal the true state of her marriage, but it had also, ultimately, provided the catalyst needed for genuine change that neither she nor Edmund might have pursued without first confronting the uncomfortable truth of how far apart they had drifted during their years of comfortable but ultimately unsatisfying routine. As they stepped together through the front doors of Ashworth Hall, Mrs. Dobbs waiting to greet them with her usual warm efficiency, Eleanor felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, genuinely content with the life she had built, not because her marriage had suddenly become perfect or without ongoing challenges, but because it had finally become honest, built on genuine attention and mutual respect, rather than polite performance and quiet neglect. A full year passed before Eleanor allowed herself to fully trust the changes that had taken root within her marriage, and by the time the anniversary of that rainy evening arrived once more, she found herself reflecting on how thoroughly the texture of her daily life had transformed since that painful night. Edmund's attentiveness had not faded with the passing months as she had quietly feared it might, but had instead settled into a genuine, lasting habit, woven naturally into the fabric of their partnership, rather than remaining a deliberate effort requiring constant reminder. Their morning conversations over breakfast continued without interruption, now covering a wide range of subjects from estate management to Eleanor's expanding charitable work with Amelia, work that had grown considerably over the year, to include a small school established for the children of widowed tenants on the Ashworth lands. Edmund had contributed generously to this project, not merely through financial support, but through genuine involvement, occasionally accompanying Eleanor to visit the school and speaking warmly with the children and their mothers about their progress. Lady Amelia Hartley remained a close and trusted friend to both Edmund and Eleanor, the old whispers of impropriety having long since faded into forgotten memory as society moved on to newer subjects of interest. She had, in the intervening months, developed her own romantic attachment to a kind and steady gentleman named Henry Whitmore, a match that pleased both Edmund and Eleanor considerably, having come to genuinely value her friendship and wishing her every happiness in her own life. Charlotte Bennet, too, remained a constant presence in Eleanor's life, the two friends having grown even closer through their shared work supporting the region's widowed women and their families. It was Charlotte who remarked, during a quiet afternoon visit shortly before the anniversary of the original incident, on how remarkably different Eleanor seemed, compared to the tired, guarded woman she had comforted, following that difficult evening a year earlier. "You seem truly happy now," Charlotte observed, watching Eleanor pour tea with the easy confidence of a woman fully settled into her own life. "Not merely content, as you once described your marriage, but genuinely happy." "I believe I am," Eleanor said thoughtfully, considering the observation carefully before responding. It did not happen quickly, and it did not happen through any single grand gesture. It happened through months of small, consistent choices, on both our parts, to genuinely see and value each other, rather than simply coexist politely. Edmund, for his part, had continued to grow in his attentiveness not only toward Eleanor, but toward the broader responsibilities of his position as Duke, finding that the same careful attention he now applied within his marriage seemed to extend naturally into other areas of his life as well. His tenants noticed a new willingness on his part to listen carefully to their concerns, rather than simply issuing decisions from a comfortable distance, and his fellow nobility noticed a man who seemed genuinely engaged in conversation, rather than merely performing the expected social courtesies. The staff at Ashworth Hall, too, noticed the changed atmosphere within the household, Mrs. Dobbs remarking privately to another longtime servant that the house had taken on a warmer, more genuine feeling since the difficult events of that rainy autumn evening, as though the entire household had somehow absorbed the renewed warmth existing between its master and mistress. On the actual anniversary of the incident, Edmund surprised Eleanor with a quiet, private gesture that required no grand announcement or public display. He arranged for a small, comfortable carriage to be prepared, and rather than attending any social gathering that evening, he invited Eleanor to join him for a simple drive through the countryside surrounding their estate, following, at a leisurely and comfortable pace, much of the same route she had once walked alone through pouring rain. "I wish to create a different memory for this particular road," he explained, as they settled comfortably into the carriage together, warm blankets arranged around them against the evening chill. "One where you are never left to walk it alone." Eleanor felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, moved by the thoughtfulness of the gesture, simple as it was. "Thank you, Edmund. Though I must confess, I no longer think of that road with only sadness. It taught me something important about my own strength, something I might never have discovered had that evening gone differently." "Perhaps," Edmund acknowledged, taking her hand gently in his own as the carriage moved smoothly along the familiar road. "Though I still wish I had spared you the pain required to learn it. I am simply grateful that you allowed me the opportunity to become a better husband afterward, rather than giving up on our marriage entirely, as you would have had every right to do. I considered it, in those first difficult days," Eleanor admitted honestly. "But I saw, eventually, genuine effort on your part rather than empty apology, and that effort made all the difference." They rode together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the familiar countryside pass by in the gentle evening light. The small bakery where Mrs. Abbott had once offered shelter and kindness, now visible ahead along the road. Eleanor asked Edmund to stop briefly, wishing to introduce him to the kind woman who had shown her such unexpected warmth during her most difficult hour, and Edmund readily agreed, genuinely curious to meet someone who had played such a significant role in his wife's story, even if he had not known of her existence until this moment. Mrs. Abbott greeted them warmly, clearly pleased to see the Duchess again, and delighted to learn that circumstances had improved so considerably since their previous meeting. She pressed a small loaf of fresh bread into their hands as a parting gift, refusing any payment, despite Edmund's insistence, and wished them both continued happiness as they climbed back into their carriage to continue their journey. "She was kind to me when I needed it most," Eleanor explained, as they resumed their drive. "I have never forgotten it." "Then we shall remember to visit her regularly," Edmund said, "and perhaps find some way to properly thank her for the comfort she offered you during such a difficult night." This small gesture, arranging future visits to thank a humble shopkeeper who had offered simple human kindness during a moment of genuine need, struck Eleanor as further evidence of the man Edmund had become over the preceding year. A man who now understood that genuine care extended not only toward those in his own social circle, but toward anyone who had shown compassion when it mattered most. As their carriage finally returned to Ashworth Hall that evening, the great house glowing warmly against the darkening sky, Eleanor reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her from that cold, lonely walk home to this comfortable, warm evening, beside a husband who had genuinely transformed his understanding of what their marriage required. She thought of the strength she had discovered in herself during that difficult walk, strength she carried with her still, not as a defense against future disappointment, but as a foundation from which genuine partnership and happiness had ultimately grown. The story of the carriage given away to another lady had once threatened to define her marriage through pain and neglect. Instead, through patience, honesty, and genuine effort on both their parts, it had become instead the beginning of something far more valuable, a partnership built not on the practical convenience that had first brought them together, but on the genuine attention and respect that had grown steadily between them in the months and years that followed. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage that evening, with Edmund's hands supporting her own, and together they walked up the steps of their home, no longer two people performing the roles expected of a duke and his duchess, but two people who had genuinely learned to see and value each other, building, day by day, the kind of marriage that Eleanor had once only dared to hope for during her most uncertain and hopeful early days as a young bride. There was another thread to this story, one that unfolded quietly alongside the central events at Ashworth Hall, involving Eleanor's younger brother, Henry Winters, a thoughtful young man who had always held a particular fondness for his sister, and a natural suspicion toward the practical arrangement that had bound her to a man he barely knew during the earliest years of her marriage. Henry had been away at university during much of the difficult period following the incident with the carriage, occupied with his studies, and only receiving news of the situation through occasional letters from Eleanor, who had been careful to soften the details considerably in her correspondence, not wishing to burden her brother with worries he could do little to address from such a distance. It was only when Henry returned home for an extended visit during the following summer, several months after Edmund and Eleanor had begun their gradual process of rebuilding genuine partnership, that he had the opportunity to observe the state of his sister's marriage firsthand. He arrived at Ashworth Hall with more than a little wariness, having harbored quiet resentment toward Edmund ever since hearing, through the careful understatement of Eleanor's letters, that she had once been left to walk home alone through pouring rain, while her husband attended to another woman's comfort instead. Henry had half expected to find his sister diminished by such treatment, resigned to a marriage of quiet suffering, as so many women of their class were forced to accept. Instead, he found Eleanor more vibrant and confident than he remembered her being in years, genuinely engaged in conversation about her charitable work, speaking of household matters with evident authority and pride, and treating Edmund with a warmth that seemed entirely at odds with the picture Henry had constructed in his mind, based on her earlier, carefully guarded letters. "You seem well," Henry observed cautiously during their first private conversation, taking a walk together through the gardens on the morning after his arrival. "Better than I expected, given what you wrote to me some months back." "I am well, Henry," Eleanor assured him, linking her arm through his as they strolled along the familiar garden paths. "Though I will not pretend the road here was an easy one." "Tell me honestly," Henry pressed, "has he truly changed, or are you simply making the best of a difficult situation, as Mother always taught us women in our position must learn to do?" Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering, understanding her brother's protective concern and wishing to give him an honest rather than merely reassuring response. "I asked myself that same question many times during the early weeks after the incident, Henry. I watched carefully for signs that his effort was merely performance meant to smooth over an embarrassing situation rather than genuine change. But months have now passed, and the attentiveness has not faded. If anything, it has grown steadier and more natural with time. I believe, as much as I can believe anything about another person's heart, that Edmund has genuinely changed." Henry remained somewhat skeptical throughout the early days of his visit, watching Edmund's behavior with the careful scrutiny of a protective younger brother determined not to be easily won over by surface politeness. But as the days passed, he found himself gradually persuaded by the consistency of what he observed, the genuine curiosity Edmund showed toward Eleanor's opinions during dinner conversations, the small, thoughtful gestures that seemed to arise naturally rather than from calculated effort, the easy warmth that had clearly developed between husband and wife, in place of the distant courtesy Henry had witnessed during his previous visits years earlier. By the conclusion of his stay, Henry found himself approaching Edmund directly, a conversation he had not originally intended to have, but which felt necessary given what he had witnessed during his time at Ashworth Hall. "I confess I arrived here with considerable reservations about you," Henry admitted, the two men standing together near the stables as Henry prepared for his departure. "My sister's letters, though carefully measured, revealed enough for me to worry that she had settled into an unhappy marriage of convenience." "Your concern was not unfounded," Edmund replied honestly. "I failed her in ways I am only now beginning to fully understand, and I do not deserve easy forgiveness for the years of inattention that preceded our current understanding." "And yet she has forgiven you," Henry observed. "Or at least, she has chosen to build something new with you, rather than resign herself to quiet unhappiness." "She has been more generous than I likely deserve," Edmund acknowledged. "I intend to spend the rest of our marriage proving myself worthy of that generosity, Henry. Not through grand gestures, but through the kind of consistent attention I so carelessly withheld during our earlier years together." Henry departed from Ashworth Hall that summer, with his earlier suspicions considerably softened, writing to their mother shortly afterward to report, with evident relief, that Eleanor's marriage had developed into something genuinely warm and promising, quite unlike the careful, distant arrangement he had witnessed during his previous visits. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Edmund found himself increasingly applying the same careful attention he now offered Eleanor toward the broader responsibilities of his position, a shift that did not go unnoticed among his tenants and household staff. A particular test of this newfound attentiveness arrived when a dispute developed between two tenant families over the boundary of a shared grazing field, a disagreement that had simmered for years without proper resolution due to previous management's tendency to postpone difficult conversations in favor of more immediately pressing matters. In earlier years, Edmund might have delegated such a matter entirely to his steward, content to remain informed only of the final outcome, without personally involving himself in the details of the dispute. Instead, he chose to visit both families personally, listening carefully to each side's grievances, walking the disputed boundary himself to better understand the practical realities involved, and ultimately proposing a compromise solution that addressed the legitimate concerns of both parties, rather than simply favoring whichever family held more social standing within the community. The tenants, accustomed to receiving decisions handed down from a comfortable distance, were visibly surprised by the Duke's personal involvement and genuine attentiveness to their concerns. Word of this careful, thoughtful handling of the dispute spread quickly through the surrounding countryside, and Edmund found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, developing a reputation among his tenants as a fair and attentive landlord, a reputation that stood in notable contrast to the more distant, business-like relationship he had maintained with his lands during the earlier years of his tenure as Duke. Eleanor noticed this broader shift in her husband's character with genuine pride, understanding that the same lesson he had learned within their marriage, that genuine attention and presence mattered more than mere adequate provision, had begun extending naturally into every corner of his responsibilities. She mentioned this observation to Charlotte during one of their regular visits, remarking on how thoroughly the events of that difficult rainy evening had ultimately reshaped not only her marriage, but her husband's entire approach to his role within their community. "It is a strange thing," Eleanor reflected, "to find such unexpected good, arising from what felt, at the time, like one of the most painful experiences of my life." "Perhaps that is often how genuine growth occurs," Charlotte suggested thoughtfully, "rarely through comfortable circumstances, but through difficult moments that force us to confront truths we might otherwise have avoided indefinitely." Charlotte herself, meanwhile, had begun to notice a particular gentleman showing considerable interest in her company during the various social gatherings she attended alongside Eleanor, a development that provided a welcome source of lighter conversation between the two friends during their regular visits. Mr. Frederick Ellison, a widower with a modest but respectable estate some distance from Ashworth Hall, had made his admiration for Charlotte increasingly evident over the preceding months, and Eleanor took considerable delight in encouraging her friend to consider his attentions seriously, understanding well enough from her own experience the value of a partner who demonstrated genuine, consistent care rather than merely pleasant but distant courtesy. "You deserve the same happiness you helped me find, Charlotte," Eleanor told her friend during one such conversation. "Do not dismiss Mr. Ellison's attentions too quickly, simply because you have grown comfortable in your independence. Genuine partnership, when built on honest attention, can offer something independence alone cannot provide." Charlotte, who had remained unmarried following an earlier disappointment in her youth, found herself genuinely considering Eleanor's advice, watching her friend's own transformed marriage as evidence that genuine happiness within partnership remained possible even after earlier difficulties or disappointments. By the following spring, Charlotte had accepted Mr. Ellison's proposal, and Eleanor took particular joy in supporting her dear friend through the preparations for her wedding, delighted to see genuine happiness extending outward from her own household into the lives of those she cared for most deeply. Not everyone within the Ashworth family circle greeted the changes in Edmund and Eleanor's marriage with immediate approval. Edmund's aunt, Lady Constance Ashworth, a formidable widow who had long held considerable influence within the family, and who had originally championed the practical match between Edmund and Eleanor, expressed open skepticism when she first heard reports of her nephew's transformed behavior. "Marriages built on practical arrangement are not meant to become sentimental affairs," she remarked pointedly, during a visit to Ashworth Hall some months after the original incident, her sharp eyes studying Eleanor across the drawing room with evident scrutiny. "I do hope, Edmund, that you have not allowed yourself to become foolishly indulgent simply to smooth over an embarrassing evening." Edmund, who might once have deferred automatically to his aunt's strong opinions on matters of family conduct, found himself instead responding with a calm but firm conviction that surprised even him. "I have not become indulgent, Aunt Constance. I have simply come to understand that a marriage without genuine attention between husband and wife is a poor foundation upon which to build a lasting household, whatever practical benefits may have originally justified the arrangement." Lady Constance raised an eyebrow at this response, clearly unaccustomed to such direct disagreement from her nephew, but something in his steady conviction seemed to give her pause. She observed the household more carefully during the remainder of her visit, watching the easy warmth that had developed between Edmund and Eleanor, the genuine respect with which the household staff now spoke of their mistress, the evident happiness that seemed to have settled over the entire estate since her previous visit. By the conclusion of her stay, Lady Constance found herself, somewhat reluctantly, acknowledging a grudging respect for the changes she observed, though she remained characteristically unwilling to offer any direct praise. "Well," she said finally, as she prepared to depart, "I suppose there is something to be said for a household that runs with genuine contentment, rather than mere obligation. Do try not to become entirely sentimental about the matter, Edmund. Some restraint remains appropriate, even in matters of the heart." Edmund merely smiled at this characteristically reserved acknowledgement, understanding well enough that for a woman of his aunt's temperament and generation, this represented as close to genuine approval as she was likely to offer. Lady Priscilla Vane, whose sharp tongue had done so much to complicate matters during the earlier months of gossip and speculation, found her own circumstances shifting considerably as the following year unfolded. Having built much of her social standing on her talent for uncovering and elaborating upon the misfortunes of others, she discovered herself increasingly without interesting material to work with, as the Ashworth marriage settled into visible, genuine contentment that offered little fodder for scandalous speculation. More significantly, Lady Vane found her own reputation somewhat damaged when it became known throughout society that her own husband had engaged in a rather more serious impropriety than anything she had ever managed to suggest about Edmund and Lady Amelia, a scandal involving considerable gambling debts and a hasty departure from the city that left Lady Vane herself the subject of the very gossip she had once so enthusiastically spread about others. Eleanor, upon hearing of Lady Vane's difficulties, felt no particular satisfaction in her rival's misfortune, understanding well enough the genuine pain that lay behind even the most unpleasant public scandal. She surprised several of her acquaintances by extending a measure of quiet kindness toward Lady Vane during this difficult period, including her, in a small gathering of ladies organizing charitable support for the region's widowed families, an inclusion that Lady Vane accepted with evident surprise and gratitude, having expected considerably harsher treatment given her own past behavior toward Eleanor. "I did not expect such kindness from you," Lady Vane admitted quietly during one such gathering, "given how thoroughly I contributed to the difficulties you faced last autumn." "We have all made mistakes we later regret," Eleanor replied simply. I see no benefit in holding on to old grievances when there is genuine good work to be done in the present. This small act of grace on Eleanor's part did not go unnoticed within their social circle, and gradually, Eleanor found her own reputation growing considerably, beyond that of simply the Duchess who had once been treated carelessly by her husband. She became known, instead, as a woman of genuine substance and compassion, respected not merely for her position, but for the thoughtful, principled manner in which she conducted herself even toward those who had once wronged her. The small charitable school that Eleanor and Amelia had established for the children of widowed tenants continued to flourish throughout this period, growing from its modest beginnings into a genuinely valuable resource for the surrounding community. Eleanor took particular pride in visiting the school regularly, getting to know the individual children by name, understanding their particular struggles and small triumphs, and ensuring that the education offered there prepared them genuinely for whatever opportunities might eventually become available to them. One young girl in particular, a bright and curious child named Margaret, whose mother had been widowed during a difficult winter illness 2 years earlier, caught Eleanor's particular attention through her evident intelligence and eagerness to learn. Eleanor began taking a more personal interest in Margaret's education, providing additional books and materials beyond what the school could ordinarily offer, and eventually arranging for the girl to receive additional tutoring that might allow her to pursue opportunities well beyond what her circumstances might otherwise have permitted. Edmund, observing his wife's genuine investment in Margaret's future, found himself similarly drawn into supporting the young girl's education, occasionally joining Eleanor on her visits to the school, and taking evident pleasure in watching Margaret's confidence and abilities grow under their combined encouragement. This shared investment in a cause beyond their own household provided yet another avenue through which Edmund and Eleanor's partnership continued to deepen, their combined efforts toward genuine good in their community serving as a natural extension of the honest attention they had learned to offer one another. "I never expected," Edmund remarked to Eleanor one evening, as they returned from a visit to the school, "that learning to properly attend to my own marriage would lead me toward such genuine investment in matters I once would have left entirely to my steward's management." Attention, once genuinely practiced, tends to extend naturally outward, Eleanor observed. Perhaps that is one of the more valuable lessons this entire difficult experience has taught us both. As the second anniversary of the original incident approached, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how thoroughly her life had transformed since that cold, rainy evening when she had first walked home alone through the darkness, uncertain of her own worth within a marriage that had seemed to offer only polite indifference. The pain of that evening remained a genuine memory, one she did not attempt to minimize or forget entirely. But it had become, over the intervening years, transformed into something closer to gratitude, understanding, as she now did the genuine growth and happiness that had ultimately emerged from that painful beginning. It was during the early days of that second spring following the incident that Eleanor discovered she was expecting their first child, a discovery that brought with it both genuine joy and a quiet test of everything Edmund had worked to demonstrate over the preceding months. Eleanor remembered clearly the winter years earlier, when illness had confined her to bed for 2 long weeks, and Edmund had continued attending his usual social engagements, with only dutiful evening visits to check on her condition. She wondered, in the early days of her pregnancy, whether old habits might reassert themselves, now that her condition required genuine care and occasional limitation of her usual activities. Her concerns proved, to her considerable relief, entirely unfounded. When Eleanor experienced a difficult bout of morning sickness during the early months of her pregnancy, Edmund immediately canceled several planned engagements without her even needing to ask, remaining close to the house and personally overseeing arrangements to ensure her comfort. He consulted regularly with the household physician regarding her care, asked thoughtful questions about what foods and activities might ease her discomfort, and made a point of sitting with her during the worst of her difficult mornings, rather than retreating to his study to avoid the unpleasantness. "You need not remain here on my account," Eleanor told him one particularly difficult morning, feeling somewhat embarrassed by her own weakened condition. "I know such matters can hardly be pleasant to witness. I would rather be here, uncomfortable as the circumstances may be, than absent while you endure difficulty alone," Edmund replied simply, holding a cool cloth gently against her forehead. "I made that mistake once before, during your illness, those years ago, and I have no wish to repeat it now." Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes, moved as much by his evident sincerity as by the physical discomfort of her condition. You remember that illness then? I remember it with considerable regret, Edmund admitted. I told myself at the time that my continued social obligations were simply necessary duties I could not avoid, but I understand now that duty and genuine care need not be mutually exclusive, and that I chose, on many occasions during those years, to prioritize the former while neglecting the latter. As Eleanor's pregnancy progressed through the following months, Edmund's attentiveness only continued to deepen, and their household staff observed with evident approval the genuine partnership that had developed between their master and mistress. Mrs. Dobbs, in particular, took considerable satisfaction in watching Edmund personally arrange for a comfortable chair to be brought into Eleanor's favorite reading room as her condition advanced, ensuring she need not strain herself unnecessarily, while continuing her charitable correspondence and household management duties. Lady Amelia and Charlotte, both now happily settled in their own respective situations, Amelia recently married to Mr. Henry Whitmore, and Charlotte, enjoying the early months of her own marriage to Mr. Frederick Ellison, provided Eleanor with considerable support and companionship throughout her pregnancy, the three women having developed a genuine bond of friendship that extended well beyond their earlier, more complicated introduction to one another. It is remarkable, Amelia observed during one visit, watching Edmund fuss gently over ensuring Eleanor's chair was positioned comfortably near the window, how thoroughly your husband has transformed since that unfortunate evening at the Whitfield Gala. I confess, I sometimes struggle to reconcile this attentive man with the one who so carelessly overlooked your presence that night. People can genuinely change, Eleanor replied, watching Edmund with evident fondness as he arranged a small footstool beneath her feet, when they are given honest reason to understand the necessity of that change, and when they possess genuine willingness to do the difficult work required to achieve it. The birth of their daughter, whom they named Grace, in recognition of the difficult journey that had ultimately led to such genuine happiness within their marriage, arrived during the early autumn of that year, almost exactly 2 years after the original incident with the carriage had first exposed the quiet neglect within their relationship. Edmund remained close throughout Eleanor's labor, pacing anxiously in the corridor outside her chambers rather than retreating to his study or seeking distraction elsewhere, and he was the first to hold their newborn daughter, following her safe arrival, tears of genuine joy visible in his eyes as he gazed down at the small, healthy child. "She is perfect," he murmured, carefully passing the infant to Eleanor, who lay exhausted but radiant against her pillows. "As perfect as her mother." Eleanor smiled tiredly, accepting her daughter into her arms, with the particular tenderness of a new mother, beholding her child for the first time. "We shall raise her, Edmund, to understand from her earliest days that genuine attention and honest partnership form the foundation of any relationship worth having, whether within marriage or friendship or any other bond she may form throughout her life. I shall try to be the kind of father who demonstrates that lesson through action rather than mere words," Edmund promised, settling carefully onto the edge of the bed beside his wife and newborn daughter. "Just as I have tried, these past 2 years, to be the kind of husband who demonstrates genuine care through consistent action, rather than empty gesture." The following months brought considerable happiness to Ashworth Hall, as the household adjusted to the presence of young Grace, and Eleanor found herself, watching Edmund's evident devotion to their daughter, increasingly confident that the transformation within their marriage had become permanent, rather than merely a temporary correction, following an embarrassing incident. Edmund made a point of spending time with Grace each day, despite his considerable responsibilities managing the estate, learning to hold her properly, singing softly to her during her fussier moments, and generally demonstrating the same careful, genuine attention toward his daughter that he had learned to offer his wife. It was during a grand ball held the following winter, celebrating the marriage of a prominent family within their social circle, that Eleanor found herself reflecting most clearly on how thoroughly her circumstances had changed since that painful evening years earlier. The ball, held in one of the city's grandest venues, brought together much of the same society that had witnessed the original incident and subsequent gossip, and Eleanor felt a small, private satisfaction in attending this particular gathering as a woman who had not only survived her earlier humiliation, but had ultimately built something genuinely valuable from its painful beginning. Edmund remained attentive throughout the evening, introducing Eleanor to new acquaintances with evident pride, seeking her opinion during conversations about political and social matters, and generally demonstrating the same genuine partnership that had become the hallmark of their marriage over the preceding 2 years. When the time came to depart, he personally arranged for their carriage without any need for reminder or request, escorting Eleanor to it with the same careful attention he had shown consistently since that first difficult conversation in her private sitting room. As their carriage pulled away from the grand venue, Eleanor glanced out the window at the other departing guests, noticing among them several ladies waiting patiently, while their husbands remained engaged in lingering conversations, apparently unconcerned with their wives' comfort or need for timely departure. She felt genuine sympathy for these women, understanding intimately the particular loneliness of standing forgotten while a husband's attention remained elsewhere. But she also felt, in contrast, genuine gratitude for how thoroughly her own circumstances had transformed since she had once occupied that same difficult position. "You seem thoughtful this evening," Edmund observed, noticing her contemplative expression as their carriage moved through the quiet streets toward home. "I was simply reflecting," Eleanor said, "on how far we have traveled since that first rainy evening, both literally and in every other sense that matters." Edmund reached over and took her hand gently in his own, a gesture that had become natural and comfortable between them over the preceding years. "I think of that evening often as well, Eleanor. Not with regret alone, though regret remains a genuine part of how I remember it, but with gratitude for the painful clarity it ultimately provided. Had that evening never occurred, I fear I might have continued for years, perhaps indefinitely, failing to truly see you as I do now." "Then perhaps," Eleanor said softly, resting her head against his shoulder as the carriage carried them steadily toward home, "we owe that difficult evening a strange kind of gratitude, painful as it was to endure at the time." "Perhaps we do," Edmund agreed, holding her closely against him. "Though I remain grateful, above all, that you possessed the strength and dignity to walk that difficult road alone, and the generosity afterward, to give me the chance to walk the rest of our journey together beside you, rather than forgotten and left behind." Their carriage arrived at Ashworth Hall shortly afterward, the great house glowing warmly against the winter darkness, young Grace already asleep in her nursery under the watchful care of her nurse, awaiting the morning when her parents would once again demonstrate, through simple daily attention and genuine partnership, the kind of marriage they hoped she might one day recognize as worth pursuing in her own life. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage that evening, Edmund's hand steady beneath her own, and walked with him through the front doors of the home they had built together, no longer defined by the careless incident that had once threatened to define their entire marriage, but instead by the genuine, hard-won partnership that had grown steadily, from its painful beginning, into something neither of them could have easily imagined during those first difficult days, following the incident of the carriage given so carelessly away. The road that had once carried Eleanor home alone through pouring rain had become, over time, simply another familiar path within the landscape of their shared life, its painful history transformed gradually into a quiet reminder of how genuine change remained possible, even within relationships that had grown distant through years of accumulated neglect, provided both partners possessed sufficient honesty to acknowledge the difficulty and sufficient dedication to do the patient, consistent work required to genuinely repair it. And so their story continued, not with dramatic gestures or sudden transformations, but with the quiet, daily choice to genuinely see and value one another, a choice that Eleanor and Edmund renewed each morning over breakfast, each evening during their comfortable conversations by the fire, and each time circumstances presented an opportunity for either old habits of neglect or new habits of genuine attention to assert themselves. They chose, consistently and deliberately, the latter, building through this patient daily effort a marriage that had become, in time, genuinely worthy of the deep and lasting happiness they had both, in their own ways, hoped for since the earliest days of their arranged union so many years before.